The engine Red Bull is planning for 2026 just leaked. And what's inside is so controversial, it has teams like Ferrari and Mercedes pushing the FIA to step in before it's too late. According to internal reports, Red Bull is hiding a variable compression trick that gives them 15 free horsepower. Only when the engine gets hot. Legal when cold. Illegal if detected mid-race. But here's the twist: if the FIA issues a technical directive in January, the entire Red Bull engine concept could collapse before it even touches the track. And what's worse, this might not be an isolated trick. It could be the start of a much larger engineering war. Publicly, Red Bull's powertrain program for 2026 is a bold new chapter. A factory-built engine. A technical partnership with Ford. Full independence from Honda. It's the perfect storyline until you look closer. Because while Red Bull claims to be on schedule, what they're not sharing is how they plan to match or beat the hybrid efficiency of teams like Mercedes and Audi, who've been building engine architecture for decades. Red Bull's silence here isn't accidental, it's strategic. And now, with data leaking behind closed doors, that silence is beginning to fracture. The new FIA power unit regulations were designed to stop exactly this kind of asymmetry. All manufacturers face the same limitations: 50% of power must come from electrical energy, fuel flow is capped, and any combustion tricks that boost thermal efficiency are tightly regulated. On paper, it's a level playing field. But the moment Red Bull's early data was circulated among technical delegates, several engineers reportedly spotted patterns that shouldn't be there: power spikes in the modeling that couldn't be explained by known hybrid recovery systems or standard ignition curves. This is where the official narrative starts to break. Because when a team finds something that technically isn't illegal, but wasn't anticipated by the regulation writers, it opens a dangerous window, a gray zone large enough to hide a performance weapon. And according to early leaks, that's exactly what Red Bull may be doing. The documents suggest they've found a way to compress heat cycles in a way that temporarily boosts torque without violating any of the fuel, thermal, or electric flow caps. It's clean. It's elegant. It's invisible unless you know where to look. So far, the FIA has said nothing. That's standard procedure. Until a regulation is breached in real-world testing, they don't move. But behind the scenes, technical directors across at least 4 teams, Mercedes, Ferrari, Audi, and Honda, are reportedly pressing for early clarification. Not a protest. Not an accusation. Just pressure. Because if Red Bull is building their engine around a system that will later be banned, and they find out too late, they'll lose not just money but 2 years of simulation and bench testing. This is no longer about secrets. It's about timelines. And here's where things become even more political. Ford is watching. Their return to Formula One is not just about performance, it's about optics, credibility, and reputation. If their first full-season engine debut is built on a combustion trick that gets ruled out by the FIA, it risks turning Red Bull's innovation into an international embarrassment. That adds a corporate layer to the pressure one the FIA can't afford to ignore. Because now, every regulatory decision affects not just teams, but brands. Headlines. Sponsors. Global investment strategies. What's most alarming is that Red Bull hasn't even attempted to dismiss the leak. No statement. No counter-narrative. No denial. And in Formula One, that isn't damage control, it's calculated silence. Which raises the question, are they confident the engine is legal? Or are they just buying time to finalize it before the FIA makes a ruling? Either way, the rest of the grid has interpreted this quiet as confirmation that Red Bull has crossed into dangerous territory. And once that perception spreads, the pressure on the FIA will become impossible to ignore. The public still hasn't seen the engine. No test footage. No dyno audio. No benchmarks. But the paddock doesn't need to see it to understand the threat. Because in F1, data leaks are rarely wrong. They're usually surgical, shared just enough to spark doubt, but not enough to prove anything. That's what makes this story so volatile. No one knows if Red Bull's new engine is illegal. But everyone knows it's something the 2026 regulations never saw coming. The leak didn't come from a dramatic breach or whistleblower. It came from something far more common and far more dangerous: the routine sharing of pre-homologation documentation between power unit manufacturers and FIA technical analysts. Red Bull submitted their latest performance simulations as part of the regulatory compliance process. But somewhere in that digital paperwork, someone noticed an irregularity. A subtle energy gain under specific temperature thresholds. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern, and it didn't look like anything anyone else had submitted. What stood out most was the way the engine handled combustion transition between temperature phases. Normally, a hybrid F1 engine balances power flow by integrating electric recovery with a controlled combustion rhythm. But Red Bull's numbers showed a unique pressure behavior, a transient compression fluctuation that only activated once the engine had reached a critical heat load. In essence, the engine woke up at high thermal levels, producing a torque surge that couldn't be explained by standard hybrid deployment. It looked like a trick. A very clever, very dangerous trick. At first, rival engineers weren't sure what they were looking at. Some suspected a simulation artifact. Others believed it was a bold new mapping strategy. But after comparing notes across multiple teams, a theory began to emerge: Red Bull may be exploiting a pre-ignition phase manipulation using subtle pressure shifts to stack combustion cycles in a way the current FIA rulebook doesn't explicitly prohibit. It's not quite twin ignition, not quite turbo surge, but somewhere in between. And it's happening just outside the regulatory language, which is where the most powerful F1 innovations tend to live. From there, the chain reaction began. Mercedes reportedly issued a quiet technical inquiry to the FIA, couched in vague language, asking whether thermal amplification via pressure-staged combustion would be consistent with Article 5.3 of the 2026 Power Unit Guidelines. Ferrari followed with a nearly identical request. Honda's inquiry was more pointed, asking if a fuel flow spike, triggered by temperature and not throttle, would still count toward the capped energy budget. Each question was framed politely. Technically. But the subtext was unmistakable: we think Red Bull is doing something, and we want you to stop them. Meanwhile, inside Red Bull's Milton Keynes headquarters, the response has been total silence. Engineers working on combustion modeling have been placed under new internal restrictions. Communication with Ford's North American R&D division has reportedly been throttled, now routed through a single technical director. According to one insider, access to certain thermal flow documents has been revoked even for senior staff. This isn't caution. It's containment. Red Bull appears to be preparing for two possibilities: either the FIA lets their engine through, or a technical directive lands that forces a total redesign. There is no middle ground. But the leak didn't just affect rival teams. It destabilized the FIA's timeline. They were expecting to issue technical clarifications on hybrid recovery and fuel balancing in mid-2025. Now they're under pressure to act by January, months earlier than planned. Because the moment this leak became known, every team began accelerating their power unit development strategy. They're not trying to copy Red Bull. They're trying to prepare for what happens if Red Bull is allowed to keep it. And that means shifting millions in R&D budgets, just to survive the first 3 races of 2026. And yet, Red Bull hasn't violated a single rule. That's the part that terrifies the grid. Because if this design is allowed to go unchallenged, it changes everything. It sets a precedent that opens the door to deeper manipulation of thermal cycles, pressure mapping, and phase ignition tricks. That's why this leak matters. Not because it proves Red Bull cheated, but because it proves they've outpaced the rulebook itself. And the only question now is whether the FIA is willing or able to catch up. In Formula One, legality is not about clarity, it's about timing. The rulebook is never airtight. It was never meant to be. It functions as a living document, one that responds not to theory, but to confrontation. Teams like Red Bull understand this better than anyone. And what makes the current situation so volatile is that Red Bull has found a way to operate not outside the rules, but ahead of them. The 2026 engine regulations were meant to close loopholes. But instead, they've created new technical terrain, one where Red Bull appears to be redefining combustion behavior faster than the FIA can react. The critical concept here is pre-ignition phase control, a term that doesn't even appear in the FIA's public-facing documents. That's how far ahead Red Bull might be. Instead of chasing raw horsepower or fuel efficiency, they're adjusting the shape and timing of pressure waves during ignition, in a way that temporarily transforms the combustion chamber into a controlled detonation zone. It's not illegal. It's just undefined. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because if there's no language in the rules to forbid it, there's no authority to stop it unless the FIA intervenes with a mid-cycle directive. But the moment the FIA steps in, they open themselves up to something even worse than controversy: precedent. If they issue a directive against Red Bull now, it will be seen as a targeted move against innovation, exactly the kind of favoritism they've been accused of in the past. If they don't, and Red Bull's engine proves dominant, they'll be blamed for letting the sport fall into imbalance. It's a regulatory trap. And Red Bull has maneuvered the FIA into it brilliantly. No matter what happens next, someone will claim the system is broken and someone else will say Red Bull simply outsmarted the room. And let's not forget, Red Bull has done this before. They didn't just revolutionize aerodynamics with blown diffusers and flexible wings, they redefined the very boundaries of what legal means. In 2012, they passed deflection tests by designing parts that flexed only under aerodynamic load, not static pressure. In 2021, they walked the line on floor stiffness and rear wing compliance. And now, they're doing it again, but this time with combustion. It's not innovation in the traditional sense. It's innovation as regulatory judo, using the FIA's own blind spots against them. Meanwhile, the rest of the grid is in a panic. Because Red Bull's potential advantage isn't just theoretical, it's structural. Engine development for 2026 must be frozen early. If the FIA allows Red Bull to finalize this system, and then bans it after the fact, it's already too late. The damage will be done. The performance gap will be locked in. And unless rivals copy the concept, which may not even be possible without identical architecture, they'll be starting the new era on the back foot. That's the nightmare scenario, a legal engine that kills the season before it starts. The FIA, of course, could delay action. They could request further testing, schedule follow-up reviews, and issue temporary clarifications that stop short of outright bans. But this only buys time, it doesn't solve the core problem. Red Bull is innovating inside a void. A place where the rules aren't broken, but simply incomplete. And unless someone defines that void, it will continue to expand. Every week that passes without a ruling gives Red Bull more time to optimize, refine, and lock in performance that the others might never be able to catch. And yet, the most troubling question remains unanswered. What if Red Bull's design is just the beginning? What if other teams, inspired or threatened by this leak, begin to explore similar gray zones? The 2026 rulebook could become a battlefield of undeclared tricks and undeclared risks, each one pushing the technical narrative further from parity and deeper into regulatory chaos. And if that happens, the FIA won't just be chasing Red Bull. They'll be chasing a culture shift they no longer control.